Excellent. Well, good morning and welcome. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, my name is Chris. I'm lead pastor here at Hoboken Grace. And one of the things you may not know is that we are actually a satellite location for the Global Leadership Summit. That's going to be taking place here in just a couple of weeks. And if you go on our app and go to events, if you go to all of our events or our growth events, you'll see that there for you to be able to register to be part of that. And as we come into today, they've actually given us a discount for the next 10 days. So if you register in the next 10 days, that actually moves the price from $250 to $170. And it really is an incredible experience as you get to hear from all of these different leaders in all of these different sectors and just speaking into your life about, okay, how do you continue growing as a leader? And I love that we get to bring this into our current conversation because if you haven't been with us, we have been working through this conversation about work and how we grow in that. And so I hope that you'll take advantage of that with the Global Leadership Summit. The other thing that we're doing today is if you check in today, we're actually, because we have a couple free tickets that they give us because of the fact that we host it here, we're actually giving away one of them in every service. So if you check in, they're going to randomly select someone later on in the service if you would like to be part of that. Well, as I said, today we are actually in the midst of this series, 9 to 5, and we're actually bringing that conversation to a close. If you haven't been with us, we've been looking at this reality that our calling is not our vocation, and that our calling is actually much bigger than that. As God steps in our life, He's placed a calling on our life, but it doesn't have to do with what we're going to do. Our calling is not what we will do. Our calling is who we're becoming. And so your calling moves across multiple vocations, and for most of us, it will take us into a lot of different vocations as we're in this journey or on this journey with God. But if our calling is not what we're going to do, it's who we're going to become, then it does impact the questions that we ask about our vocation. And for the last couple of weeks, you can go back and watch or listen online, we've been changing those questions and asking maybe some new questions about, okay, what is it that I'm going to do with my life? And how do I bring my vocation into alignment with that calling? And today what I want to do is I want to add one final piece to that puzzle as we're engaged in this conversation of, okay, how do I bring my alignment or my vocation into alignment with my calling? To do that, I want to take you to a passage that we actually talked about at the end of last week's conversation where God makes a couple of promises. He's speaking to Adam, and he's talking to Adam right after sin enters the picture. And he says this, it says, to Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. And in this moment, God reveals a couple things to us. One is that when sin enters the picture, God actually curses the ground. He does this because of the fact that He never wants us to think that this is the way that it's supposed to be. He wants us to always understand that, no, the world that we live in is broken. Not just that we're broken, but that the whole thing is broken. And so He tells Adam, okay, listen, the world that you live in is different now. And He says, I'm going to make a promise to you. Work is going to be hard. It says, through painful toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. And this other thing, it will produce thorns and thistles for you. So even as you're working at it, not only is it going to be difficult, but what you want for it to produce, oftentimes it's not. As a matter of fact, it's going to produce the opposite of what you want for it to produce. Because I want you to understand the reality of sin and what sin does. And so as we talked about last week, he introduces us to this idea that you should expect that work will be hard. You work in a broken world. But then in addition to that, he tells Adam, and there's also going to be thorns and thistles. And sometimes, as we engage work on this journey, those will be actual thorns and thistles. I grew up on a farm. And we spend a lot of time trying to eliminate the thorns and the thistles and the weeds and to get that out. But for a lot of us, it's not going to be actual thorns and thistles. For a lot of us, the thorns and thistles are oftentimes people. And the coworkers that you have to engage, or the boss that you work for. And God says, no, there's going to be a lot of situations where you're working for something and you get something else. And you worked hard, and you were faithful, and you did the right thing. And you were a good employee. But someone else got the promotion. Because you weren't willing to go to the Coldplay concert with your boss. It just fits so perfect. I had to put it in. Too soon? But that's the reality. That's the reality of it. And God says one of the things that you need to understand, now that you work in a broken world, is that there's going to be thorns and thistles. And sometimes you're going to do it right, but it's not going to produce what you thought. So sometimes you're going to get passed over, you're going to get left behind. And sometimes you're left behind because of the fact that you're faithful to your calling. Because you're not willing to sign off on those documents that your coworkers are willing to sign off on. And so how do you engage that? How should we think about that? Well, I want to take you to another passage that we've talked about a couple different times, but I want to make sure that we see this promise in there. And then I want to take you to an example, because as I've said throughout this whole thing, this is an example conversation more than it's a stated truth conversation. God doesn't give us a book of scripture that's about work. It's more of an example that he's trying to help us see, or examples that he gives us to help us see, okay, how do we engage this journey with him as it pertains to this area of our life? But the passage that I want to take you back to, and again, we've talked about it a couple times, but I want to make sure that you see this promise, because this is critical. If you're going to engage the thorns and thistles, this is critical. It says this, Colossians chapter 3, it says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men. And then he says this, I hope you've picked up on this promise as we've been moving through this. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Now, he's not just saying inside this passage, he's not just saying, hey, listen, I want you to work like you're working for me, because then you're going to do the right thing, or you're going to work hard. No, he actually says, I want you to work like you're working for me, and I want you to know this. Listen, I want you to know this, that there's actually a reward for that. That I actually am going to reward that. And he makes this incredible promise. And I think this is critical, because if you don't work for him, I don't know you can make it through the thorns and the thistles. And we've asked this question a couple times, but I'll ask it again. Who is it that you work for? As you walk onto that job site, as you walk into that office, who is it that you're doing it for? And what is it that you're doing it for? I think probably the greatest example as it pertains to this is actually an individual named Joseph. Some of you know Joseph's story. Some of you, this is a new story. And it's a long story. We aren't going to be able to read through all of it, but I highly encourage you to go back in Genesis and read through the whole story yourself, because Joseph's story is insane. It's a crazy story because when he's younger, he's actually sold into slavery by his brothers. They were close. It was a close family. And so he was sold into slavery. At first, they wanted to kill him, but they decided, nah, let's take it easy on him. We'll just sell him into slavery. And so they sell him as a slave. He finds himself in Egypt. And then as he's in Egypt, we'll pick up the story. Listen to what it says. It says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So he arrives in Egypt and he's purchased. Now, fortunately, he's actually purchased by someone who's fairly significant inside of the nation of Egypt. It says, the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of the household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph, and before we continue the story, let me just pause for a second, because I want you to imagine for a second, and some of you know Joseph's story, and sometimes this can help us as we're moving through stories like this. Sometimes it hurts us because you learned this story inside of Sunday school years and years ago, and there were some cartoon Josephs and people. And what can happen sometimes if we're familiar with a story, or maybe we learned it back then, but is that we don't actually take the time to put ourselves into the story and experience it. I mean, just imagine what it was like to be Joseph. And you're sold into slavery, and now you're making your way to Egypt. Maybe you're trying to figure out where it is that you're going to end up. I mean, how many days did he spend just weeping as he's trying to think of what's ahead? I mean, now your whole life is over. There's no hope. You don't get sold into slavery and have hope. Where's he going to end up? But then the story turns for good. And what looked like it was going to be thorns and thistles, now he finds himself, I mean, he's still a slave, but he finds himself inside of a well-to-do home, and inside of that, he's working his way up because he does the right thing and he's working hard. He's faithful to his employer. And it looks like things are moving in the right direction. Imagine what that was like for him. To see his life completely turn around. But the story continues. It says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And so things begin to move in the right direction, and he's making his way up. And then his master's wife comes to him. And she begins to pursue him. And when he says no once, you can think, oh, this is a good story. But no one likes to be rejected over and over and over again. And she doesn't just ask once. She asks over and over and over again. And this, again, is one of those places where we see Joseph being true to his calling, who he was becoming. It could have been really easy, especially when you get to the point where you realize this is not going to go well. If I keep saying no, this is not going to go well. It could have been really easy to just say yes. But he doesn't. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by the cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought has come to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And so Joseph does the right thing and ends up in prison. He does the right thing, and it all falls apart. What do you think Joseph's conversation with God was like in that prison? Seriously? Seriously? First I'm sold into slavery. Then I'm able to actually do something with that. I'm actually able to work my way up. I do what you ask me to do. I'm faithful to my calling, and this is what happens? I mean, where are you? I have to imagine that there were multiple nights where Joseph wondered if God had just forgotten him. Or at least where he engaged the question. Have you ever been there? I mean, Joseph's story isn't the story of a couple small thorns and thistles. At this point, it just looks like all thorns and thistles. But Joseph does what Joseph does. And so as the story continues, well, listen what happens. It says, "But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all that he held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did." And so Joseph finds himself in prison. And what does Joseph do? He keeps working. And he's faithful. And he works hard, and it's noticed. And so he begins to work his way up inside of the prison. And he ends up being over all of the prison. It's incredible. You see it multiple times inside of Joseph's life. And so you think, okay, the story's going to turn around. And again, we don't have time to read through all of it, but inside of prison, he actually finds himself with two individuals who have access to the king, or who are going to have access to the king, or one of them, the other one's going to die. But he interprets these dreams for these individuals, and he just says to the one, he says, listen, when you get back to the king, let him know. Now, here's why I really like this part of Joseph's story, because you can move through Joseph's story and just think, hey, you know what? He worked his way up in prison. He's probably doing pretty well now. He's cool with where he is. No, that's not at all the truth, because he tells the individual who's going to have access to the king, please don't forget me. Please don't leave me here. Please make sure that when you get back to him, that you tell him that I didn't actually do what I'm being accused of. But when the individual gets back to the king, he forgets about Joseph. What is happening? What is happening? As the story continues, eventually the king has a dream that needs to be interpreted. And the other guy finally remembers. He's like, oh yeah, there's this guy I left in prison. I mean, if you're Joseph, this is part of, that's not actually recorded in the story, but I would love to know. What did Joseph say to the guy when he meets him again? Seriously, just forgot about me. Really? I don't think you'd be very happy. Joseph ends up interpreting the dream, and the dream speaks about a drought that's coming, and so Joseph ends up being put in charge of really rescuing the nation of Israel, not the nation of Israel, the nation of Egypt. It ends up rescuing his family as well. But listen to what it says a little bit later on. It says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning as wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. At which point, if I'm Joseph, I'm taking care of the guy who left me in prison. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. You want to talk about a roller coaster? What a crazy life. And there's this up and down, up and down, up and down. And it looks like it's going to be incredible. And then there's all these thorns and thistles. But through it all, Joseph remains faithful to his calling. And after his father dies, because not only does he save the nation of Israel, he saves his family from famine as well. And he saves his brothers who actually sold him into slavery. His brothers think that he's going to kill them after his father dies, which shows you that they were never really close. Like, he saves them, and they're definitely talking to one another, but apparently he never got super close to the people who sold him into slavery. You don't think that someone that you're super close with is going to kill you after your father dies. So their father dies, and the brothers are freaking out because they're like, now he's going to get revenge. And in this moment, this is one of the few moments where you get to see Joseph speak. You hear Joseph speak to his journey. I want to take you there, Genesis chapter 50. It says, but Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. And in this moment, we get a little bit of insight into the way that Joseph engaged the journey. Beginning with this, Am I in the place of God? In other words, am I the one who determines this story? Am I the one who's going to make all this work out? Or determine how it should work out? Or is he? And he says, yeah. I know you brought a lot of thorns and thistles into my life. But I work for one who can use those for good. And he's the one who tells the story. And I trust him. If you don't work for him, if you work for whoever your boss is, or even if you work for yourself, the thorns and thistles are going to constantly push you to compromise your calling. They're going to tempt you over and over and over again to be the one who tells your story, to take it into your hands, to make it happen yourself. And so many of us, we live our lives stressed out because we think we're the ones who tell the story. We think we're the ones who have to make it happen. You've put yourself in the place of God because you don't trust that he can use the thorns and the thistles. And you think because of the fact that they entered your life that he's forgotten you. But he hasn't. He hasn't. But you have to change who it is that you work for. And what it is that you work for. And to trust him with the promise that he's made you. Not just that you can work for him, but that there's a reward for that. I remember several years ago working through this with God and just wrestling through it with him because our church had grown fairly significantly, and Hoboken Grace has never grown super fast. It's always been 100 people a year. And we were, I think, year 12, 13, somewhere in that range there. And we had been growing, and we had incredible momentum. At the time, we were growing faster than we'd ever grown in our history. And we had all these really exciting things happening inside of our church family, and we were about to enter into this campaign to be able to purchase space in the future. I mean, everything was moving in the right direction. And there were almost no thorns and thistles. And then COVID hit. And it was all thorns and thistles. And everything was toil. Trying to be able to create community, trying to keep community together. And we finally were able to come back together, and it was amazing to come back together. But before COVID hit, we had about 1,100 on a weekly average inside of our services. When we came back together after COVID, we were at about 500. And half the church was gone. And I remember sitting there with God, and I was like, man, we worked so hard. We worked so hard. And now half of it's just gone. We worked so hard. And so many of us have been there. You've been there. You worked so hard. You did it right. And then one day they walk in and say, hey, we've sold the company. And your department's done. Sometimes it's not just that half of it's gone. Sometimes it's that all of it's gone. And God just kept asking me this question. Who do you work for? And what are you working for? Who do you work for? And what are you working for? Because here's the reality of it. If we place ourselves in his place, and we work for ourselves, or you work for your boss, or you work for, and that moment happens and half of it's gone, guess what? Half of it's gone. But if you trust his promise that no, when you work for me, there's a reward, when that moment comes and half of it's gone, none of it's gone. Do you understand that? None of it's gone. The whole reward is still there, and no one can take it from you. But we have to change who it is that's in that place. And to put God back in his rightful place. And to make the decision, no, I work for him. And to trust him with the reward that he's promised. So often we move through life and we want God to work for us. God doesn't work for you. But he is really, really good to the people who work for him. Doesn't mean there won't be thorns and thistles. But he will be faithful with the reward. Will you pray with me? Father, I pray that as we come to the end of this conversation, I pray that, again, that this isn't just something that we would intellectually know, but I pray that this would be something that we would be practicing, that it truly would shift the way that we walk into that job site, the way we walk into that office building. That we would embrace your invitation. Your invitation to give you responsibility, to let you tell the story. That we truly would begin to work for you in everything that we do. That in that we'd be faithful and true to our calling. Even when there's thorns and thistles. Because we know you can tell the story better than we can. We know that your reward is more valuable than anything that we could manipulate or compromise in order to achieve or to accomplish. Father, I thank you for the way that you love us. I thank you that you're faithful. In Jesus' name.